Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for taking time out of our busy schedules to come to Benedictine University. We are honored to have Dr. Aasim Padela here to give our talk this afternoon. He is the director of the Initiative on Islamic Medicine, associate professor of medicine in the section of emergency medicine, and a faculty member of the McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics at the University of Chicago. Dr. Padela holds an MD from Weill Cornell Medical College, completed his residency in emergency medicine at the University of Rochester, and received a Master's in Science in Healthcare Research from the University of Michigan. His Islamic studies expertise comes via a BA in Classical Arabic from the University of Rochester, seminary studies during his formative years, and continued tutorials with traditionally trained Islamic authorities. Dr. Padela is a clinician researcher and bioethicist whose scholarship lies in the intersection of community health and religion. He utilizes diverse methodologies from healthcare research, religious studies, and comparative ethics to examine the encounter of Islam with contemporary biomedicine ethics through the lives of Muslim patients and clinicians, and in the scholarly writings of Islamic authorities. Through systematic research and strategic interventions, he seeks, 1, to improve American Muslim health outcomes and healthcare experiences, and 2, to construct a multidisciplinary field of Islamic bioethics. As a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholar from 2008 to 2011, he developed a community-based research methodology to study and intervene upon American Muslim health disparities. In 2010, as a visiting fellow at the Oxford Center of Islamic Studies, he studied Islamic moral and theological frameworks, and from 2013 to 15, as a Templeton Foundation Scholar, he led a national survey of Muslim physicians' bioethical attitudes and professional experiences. His current projects span Muslim attitudes and behaviors related to cancer screenings and end-of-life care, and the intersection of science and Islamic theory and law, and are founded by the Templeton Foundation and the American Cancer Society. Let's give a nice round of applause to Dr. Padela, please.
Thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you, Dr. Ali, for inviting me to be here today at Benedictine, and thank you all for attending. I hope that you come here and get some food for the stomach as well as some food for thought, inshallah. So I will begin our talk now. So I want to tell you that that I come to this topic, the subject matter, just as a way of disclosure, as someone who's a practicing clinician. So I see patients in the emergency department, as someone who does research in terms of healthcare, and also as one who is very interested in how the Islamic tradition is engaging with larger questions of today. And for me, those questions reside around health and healthcare. Hence, this is the title of my talk, which was given to me by Dr. Ali. So, so let me tell you a little bit about the Initiative on Islamic Medicine, where I spend my time here in Chicago. So at the initiative, we conduct research at this intersection between the Islamic tradition, biomedicine, and Muslim practices. We study how patients think about their religion and how that influences the healthcare they receive and they want to receive. We think about how Muslim physicians adopt their notions of Islam in their practice and what sort of bioethical challenges they face. And then we study how Islamic scholars who write and gaze upon biomedicine through their juridical apparatus or through their theological sort of musings. So we conduct empirical, textual, and theological research. So today I'm going to draw upon all of these areas to give you a sense of how I think about Islamic bioethics and then how I think about healthcare delivery with some Islamic values embedded within it. So there are 3 parts of this talk. The first, I'm going to describe the field of Islamic bioethics, mainly who's producing and consuming Islamic bioethics and the state of the literature. I'm going to talk about, with your help, I'm going to engage you in some conversations about what is referred to by the term Islamic. We're going to then move to the empirical lens, where I'm going to discuss religio and cultural accommodations for Muslim patients, talk about the top 3 notions of accommodations that they desire in healthcare, and then some of the religious concepts that underpin them. And then at the end, should we have time, I'm going to talk a little bit about or sort of comment on a vision for the holistic Islamic ethics in healthcare delivery. So here starts the audience participation. I know we have about an hour, so this will take long or short depending on your own participation in this. So you're all here today with some title of Islamic Bioethics within the talk, and I'm going to ask you what you think Islamic Bioethics is, so that I can speak to that. So, you're here. I'm listening.
I'm trying to understand, like, what makes it different from, like, other field of ethics
Mm-hmm.
when it's mentioned Islamic bioethics.
Right. So you want to see what distinguishes Islamic bioethics from other areas.
From the traditional practices of ethics.
So perhaps you will get at that. But what is Islamic bioethics to you?
I think, to me, Islam is the practice of right and wrong,
Mm-hmm.
bringing justice, and ethics is the same thing,
Okay.
like principle of guidance to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, from my perspective, I don't see any difference between Islamic and ethics.
Okay.
And when it comes to bioethics, I don't know.
All right. So the bio piece might be a bit different, but okay. Other thoughts on what is Islamic bioethics, please?
The approach to medical decision making that's informed by Islamic framework.
Okay. Please.
What's normal? Like, for example, if you're a physician in the medical field, what's normal to you as a first as a human being, and then secondly as what your faith is?
Okay. So the previous person sort of said that Islamic sort of vision for some challenges that they face, and yours also building upon that, right? So a moral vision. Okay, very good. So Islamic bioethics, I think you can go to Google and see what it says, but before you do so, and the reason I asked you this question is that I believe for anybody in this area or interested in this area, you need some conceptual tools before you start searching around what Islamic bioethics is, right? We need to deconstruct the notions of the Islamic, the bio, and the ethics before we look at Islamic bioethics or what Google tells us or what PubMed might tell us, or if you go into the library and pick out a book on Islamic bioethics. And this is a large task because I think all of us come with our own understanding, and all the individuals who are writing in this space come with their own understanding. And sometimes those are unspoken assumptions that you understand what they're talking about. But there might not be those, right? There might not be a shared vision for what the Islam is, nor what the Islamic refers to, nor what is the bio piece, nor what is ethics. So to do this, I'm going to actually help me deconstruct, right? So we're just going to look at these pieces of this term. So the Islam, you had mentioned the Islam, you don't see a difference between Islam and ethics, or Islam provides a notion of right and wrong. But what is Islam? If you were to say to someone, you're at a college, you're going to study Islam, what is Islam?
Belief in one
That's
God.
Shahab Ahmad's book.
I'm sorry?
Shahab
Well, the professors can't speak, but go ahead. What? What'd you say?
I said Shahab Ahmad's book. What is it?
Oh, Shah Ahmad's book. What is Islam? Yes, it's a big book. We should all look at it. It's like 700 pages, and he deconstructs this notion of what is Islam. But what is Islam for us in this room?
Belief in one God. I don't know.
In terms of category, so not explicating what things. So in terms of category, Islam refers to a what? A way of life. We say that often in our polemics. Okay, so it's a way of life. It's a what else?
Religion.
It's a religion. What does religion mean?
Having faith.
Huh?
Having faith in a greater figure, greater being.
So you're talking about a religion. A religion might have an idea about a greater being, but it has some sort of notion of something. So a notion of how to live your life. What else?
Guidance for how to navigate, kind of building off that, but how to navigate through the different aspects of life. So like different guidance, different principles that you can follow.
So it's a delineation of values that you bring through in carrying out your life. So again, a way of life. So I'm at the University of Chicago, and the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, our tagline is the academic study of religion. And when you're doing the academic study of religion, you should understand what you want to send someone on to study, right? So if an alien came tomorrow and said, go study, Buddhism, then you have to say, well, this is how you would study Buddhism. right? Or what Buddhism is. So I'm going to give you a sense of what one might say Islam might refer to, or any religion in a sense. One might say that a religion refers to some sort of textual-based sort of philosophy, right? And that has implications on how you study that, right? So there's some texts, and you can decide who decides to write them, or what's the origin of those texts, but there's some text, some body of literature that has ramifications on the way that then people live. So you study religion by looking at their texts and then how people have adopted that. Now you might say that there are people who are the conveyors or the bearers of that tradition, who are actually promulgating tradition. Right? So they're making things that are Islamic. Or they're interpreting things that are Islamic, or they're interpreting the texts. So you have texts, you have individuals or authorities, and then you have societies and individuals who are practitioners. Right? So when you're studying a religion, you say, okay, well, look at the texts, look at those who are considered authorities of the text, or who are producing the text, or who are the tradition, right? And then you look at the adopters, of those who are practicing and living that out. And they have different methodologies to study that. But what religion does, it's a truth claim. It's a claim about how things are and how they should be and what our ends will be. Right? What happened before, what was happening now, how you interpret what's happening now, and what will happen after. It's a truth claim. That's all it is. And for us, we have competing truth claims, not only within religion, but within our own lives, right? What is the truth here of giving a lecture? How should I give a lecture? There's some guidance from various people how I should give a lecture. So my point is that there are various competing truth claims, and that's what religion is making. And then there are people who are adopting that, are making meaning from that truth claim. So religion is a truth claim that then is embodied by people who make meaning of that truth claim. That's what religion is. So here, when we're talking about Islamic bioethics, right, you have to understand what the Islam is. Because you can't make an ik claim. You can't say something becomes Islamic without understanding what Islam is. Is that clear? You can't say something is belonging to the tradition without understanding what the tradition is. And I'll explain to you how I think of the tradition. But you can say that for any religion. And what's the bio doing in bioethics? Do people have a notion of that? What's the bio? Please? Life, right? So if you go to, they'll say it has to do with human life particularly, but life in general. So it's not just ethics. So there's some sort of notion of life. Others might say that the bio is here is because of the Foucauldian narrative of power, right? That bio is a means, right? So when you add this appellate to medicine, biomedicine, which I will do, I draw upon this notion. Okay, look, there are powers and authority structures that use the bio notion that has to do with life and humanity to give power and authority to this discipline, right? But traditionally, you say it just refers to, not if it's medicine here, if it's biomedicine, that it goes beyond just medicine. It has to do with life in general, not humanity. What's the ethics? What's the Islamic? And so now you said Islam and ethics, you don't distinguish very well between the two. So what's in this Islamic bioethics, what's the ethics piece here? What does it refer to and draw upon?
I think the ethics should be guided by Islamic practices.
By Islamic practices. You can't use Islam in the moment. So redefine it. So what's the ethics refer to? Just the ethics itself.
Etiquette.
The principle of doing right or wrong.
Okay, doing right or wrong. You said etiquette.
Etiquette.
How to live, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What else?
Moral principles,
Further? What do you mean?
like rules to do something.
Okay, so ethics refers to a set of rules or codes or guidelines?
Yeah, moral.
Okay. All right. Please.
How to treat the other.
Sorry?
How to treat the other people.
How to treat.
Yeah.
So ethics, so what I hear from you all, ethics has to do with mannerisms or norms of social etiquette, right? How to treat other people. Ethics has to do with some application or drawing upon or deriving from some set of principles and guidelines for those social norms, or are they separate?
In this case, we're dealing with the bio, so ethics concerning this field.
Right, but I'm just saying ethics in general. So ethics in general, I just want to understand from your perspective. So we have one class here of social etiquettes, norms, how we behave with others. You said that principles, moral principles, or some sort of guidelines help us think about that, or codes help us think about that. So are they related, and in what way? So do you think, okay, guidelines help us think about how we act, and that would be the ethics piece? Taking those guidelines and helping us act, or something else?
Crafted through guidelines and
Okay.
social etiquettes.
Okay. So which is the super category? Okay. All right. Good. So I'll prioritize that notion in a second. Is there anything else for the ethics piece? So let's move on. So I constructed the talk, or I construct the field as Islamic bioethics, but some might say it's Islamic ethics for biomedicine. Do you see a difference in that? What's the difference? You're shaking your head.
When I remember biomedicine, that means you're extending it to the research field as well. Does that involve animal experimentation and everything?
So I want you to concentrate not on the biomedicine piece. But you see here we have Islamic upon bioethics. Here we have Islamic ethics upon something else. Is that a difference conceptually for you or not?
Just the term Islamic ethics, or just the term Islamic ethics, right?
Right. So we have Islamic, so the labeling is on bioethics. Or you have Islamic ethics that then labels onto biomedicine. Do you all see any difference in this? Or am I just confusing you?
Based on what you said, Islam is a religion which is based on a bunch of, which is based on a group of texts. In this case, I'm not sure what the texts are. And ethics is so using, I guess it means using, in this case, the scriptures or the textbooks related to Islam, and combining that with the definition of ethics.
Okay, so you're sort of proceeding at how we would get to Islamic bioethics, right? You're sort of saying that we have some Islamic texts maybe, or some texts, you apply them to medicine, right? So this is how you would see it actually. You would say there's some Islamic ethics, maybe it resides in text or people, yeah? And then you take the field of medicine or biomedicine or however you want to construct it, and you say, let's take that and put it and get those people, those authorities, and have them talk about biomedicine. Am I correctly understanding what you're saying?
That is.
Do you all agree with that notion? So my talk shouldn't be Islamic bioethics. It should be Islamic ethics for medicine or biomedicine. What do you all think? Huh?
I'm not quite sure I understood.
So here's how. Right. So let me. So
I understand
this.
the question.
Yeah. So my question is there a difference between the way that we do this?
You asked me the questions, there must be.
Well, I think there is. I think there is. Okay. There's 3 more hands, and I'll explain. Go ahead.
So it's almost as if Islamic ethics for biomedicine are applying the Islamic ethics to an already established biomedicine field,
Yeah.
whereas Islamic bioethics is kind of more integrative in that the bioethics are being informed by Islam.
Yeah. So I think you're getting at that notion. I want to get a distinction, but I'll further build on it. Hey, go ahead.
The way I see it, it's step 1 and step 2.
Okay.
You start with Islamic ethics for biomedicine, you come up with Islamic bioethics.
Okay, so very good. So this is good. So you're all getting where I would place myself. So why is it step 1 before step 2? Why isn't it the other way around?
Well, you have to start someplace.
Okay.
Islamic ethics is more inclusive, the other one is more convergent.
So I'll take one more, and then you have a question, and I'll get a distinction.
I think the first one is the description of what it is, and the second one, how it is going to be applied to the biomedicine.
Okay. So so part of this kawaii that you had, this unsettling, is because I just wanted to show you that just even concepts, just 2 words, right, draw upon a bunch of knowledge that non-specialists don't understand, right? And if you just go to Google or a library and say, okay, I'm going to pick up a book on this topic, first, what does that mean to you? You have to have some notion when you're going to go start research the field. And here, I will tell you that I've come to this and I see it sort of what you're sort of saying at. So, and this has an implication for the discourse I'll just present to you, okay? But this is one of the key learning points. So people sort of normally, they say, okay, I have a tradition, I have people who understand Islamic ethics. Now there's different modes of reasoning in Islam, but we'll just tell them, look at this field, and then opine. And we'll construct an Islamic ethics for biomedicine, right? So you have some Islamic ethicists, whatever you think of the ethics is in Islam, but Islamic ethicists just come and say, okay, here we go, here's biomedicine, have at it. We have all the knowledge we need. Others might say, well, look, there is a field of body of bioethics, there's a discourse, there's individuals, there's ways to think about that. How can we then inform an Islamic version of that, right? So your starting point is different. One starting point is, I'm going to say the Islamic piece is here, I got it all, I'm going to move and bring it to the field, right? The other is, actually, I'm in the field, right? And I don't know what Islam has to say. So my own journey as a medical student was I was in a bioethics class or a medical ethics class, and people would say, what is Islamic perspective on these issues, right? So that's my journey. Now, a potentially Islamic scholar's journey would be, okay, I have an issue with my family member, they're going for this procedure, where are we at? And they would say, well, I know this, here's what I'll tell you. But neither are complete, right? Because of this notion of what's the Islamic and what's the bio and what's the ethics. Unless you have both coming together, you just have parts of the whole. So we went through this, and I'm going to skip over some of this, but I want to share a couple things from this slide. So as I said to you, when you're thinking about studying a tradition or a religion, you have to first understand what it is. And one might say that I'm going to do take a social scientific lens to the study of a religion, or Islam in this case, where Islam is a tradition of practices observed by a community, right? Or it's a meaning-making system for this community. So they're making a claim. So I'll go study, a Naqshbandi order in South Africa, and I'll understand what they think of Islam. Or you might say, well, it's predominantly a moral tradition that people have adopted in various ways. So I'm going to study the norms of that moral tradition through looking at Islamic law, perhaps, or what the people have written about Islamic virtues might be, or how other fields of other Islamic sciences interact with that, right? So trying to understand what the moral significance is, so the Islamic ethics piece. But when we think about what it signifies Islamic, so when we add this term Islamic to bioethics, you have to have some notion of where the boundaries might be. So one might say that, look, I'm going to look at Islamic bioethics, and because Islam is source-bounded, that there's the Quran and the Sunnah, right, the Word of God, and then the Prophet's sort of sayings, tacit approvals, and his mannerisms, and these constitute one singular revelatory event, and therefore it's source-bounded. So I'm going to tie anything that comes after, right, Islamic finance, Islamic bioethics, Islamic housing, Islamic whatever, that it has some sort of linkage up with these scriptural source texts. And as long as I can see that link, then it becomes Islamic. Others might say that Islamic is being produced now. That the Islamic is being produced now. That's a negotiated tradition of understandings that's promulgated by a scholarly class. That's all it is. That we are making meaning now. Right? So when your sheikh says something, he's saying something Islamic. Why? Because he's saying it. He's a sheikh. That you're making Islamic. It doesn't reside in the 6th century or the 7th century. It resides now. That we are understanding and promulgating a lived tradition, and those individuals who have some authority, and there are different ways to negotiate that authority, but they are speaking Islamic. So that has implications for this field, but for the general study of Islam. And I think many of us in the common spaces, right, don't understand what discourse we're embodying upon, and so we have mixed up notions, which leads to conflicts both in the mosque, but also in the academy. Okay. So that's my entry into this area of Islamic bioethics. So let me just kind of go through, in a sense, if we're going to start looking at Islamic bioethics, who and where are we going to go? So one notion is who's writing about Islamic bioethics, right? And traditionally, when I give my classes in the community, this is the model where people sort of say, this is what's happening, this is Islamic bioethics. You have a physician who has an issue, oftentimes from a patient they're seeing, or the patient might ask the physician about something, and they don't know, and this is a Muslim physician. They go to some scholar at the mosque or at some academy, and they say, okay, well, can I do this or can I not? What's the Islamic ethical position or the legal position on X, Y, Z? That scholar thinks about the Quran, he thinks about the Sunnah, he thinks about the maqasid, the Sharia, the objectives of law, he thinks about the legal maxims, and he produces some sort of writing on that, which becomes a fatwa. You might have many scholars coming together, many people coming together, and that becomes, something else. It becomes a part of a judicial decision, and they rule where does this action reside on the spectrum from being prohibited to being permissible to being obligatory. That is the common lay, or I would say maybe one step above lay understanding of where Islamic bioethics resides. But from what I just said a few minutes ago, you'll understand what is happening here, right? That if this is the subtotality of what Islamic bioethics is, that there might be some pieces missing. And the rest of this talk, or part of this next section, is going to talk about that. So one, yes, there are fatwa on XYZ issues, right? You can capture them online in books. We have fatwas on everything. But those are not the only individuals who are writing and claiming to write about Islamic bioethics. You have physicians writing in a medical audience, right? So this is from PubMed, papers about Islamic bioethics. You have individuals who are sitting in the academy, right, who study juridical rulings, or they study the Islamic text, or they come up with theological paradigms, or they study sort of, they study medicine, and they sort of ad hoc think about what should be the Islamic notion of that, and they write books, right? So these are individuals who are PhDs in Islamic studies, or Islamic law, or comparative ethics. Then you have various professional societies. So the top is Iman, the Islamic Medical Association of North America. They have physicians, they have an ethics committee, which I'm a member of recently, but not when this came out. So they opine together on what is Islamic ethics in medicine. And you have these other organizations. This is from the Islamic Organization for Medical Sciences in Kuwait that brings together jurists and physicians, and they sort of set up papers on what are the Islamic guidelines for death or living or whatever else it might be. So these are these organizations. And then you have ministries of health. Now I just named these because each of these, right, so this is from Saudi, Iran, Pakistan, who at least claim that their policies and laws are in some way related to Sharia law. Right? So they're writing and they're producing the Islamic. So when they say, or in a sense, so when they say, here is our health policy for human reproduction, or for contraception, or for health insurance, or for whatever it might be, they are producing something, at least in some way, should refer to, in their own theory, to Islamic. So it's not just a single jurist talking to a physician, but there's many others involved. And what happens is this is what happens. That you have a confused conceptualization of what is right and wrong, right? The ethics component. What is our duty, what is not our duty. And when people on the street or in the masjid say, okay, give me something, and they ask the imam, the sheikh, or the physician, both of them, you have this sort of nothing is really meeting the mark. Nothing is fully understanding my situation. I'll tell you that from my empirical work, that there are shortcomings in that, right? At that level. So this confusion, right, leaves all of us, both academicians and the publics, leaving for better answers about what Islamic bioethics might be. Any questions there? I'm just going to get my water. Any questions before I move to another segment? Yes?
I don't know if this makes sense, but I just kind of was thinking, so can you take like an ethical decision for like a patient, for example, and at the same time, it may conflict with Western society or what the Western, or what your teachings are, for example, in medicine, opposed to Islamic bioethics. So I don't know if that makes sense.
So are you saying that could a Muslim physician want to advise a patient of something that's contrary to conventions?
Yes. Like, for example, like there's this whole thing about euthanasia.
About euthanasia?
Euthanasia. And it's like, I'm pretty sure we all learn about it in school sometime. And it's sometimes a lot of people of faith consider that to be like against their teachings.
Right. Right.
But sometimes, I guess, in other fields, or in other ideologies, it's fine.
So I think that the answer to your question, yes, there can be times when there's conflict between what a patient's values are and what the physician's values are, as well as what the physician's values are and the larger healthcare system. Those applied questions I'm going to try to take at the end to give you some illustrations. But yes, there can be conflict, and how you resolve that is a negotiated resolution. All right. So the reason, again, I want to draw us back. So now you understand that there's a lot of people talking in this space on Islamic bioethics and their papers and their writings and their fatwa and whatever else. They sort of bring this notion, but you have to be distinguished a little bit for us. Are they talking about Islamic bioethics? They're thinking about bioethics and then trying to understand the Islamic notions within that, which is bioethics is a field that is multidisciplinary, right? It's still being formulated, has various different levels of analysis, right? So we can think about patient-doctor level, societal level, there are different levels of economic level. Or are they thinking about Islamic ethics or biomedicine in some sort of not even Islamic ethics, Islamic legal perspective in biomedicine? So for me, and one I'll leave you with is some sort of learning point. I think that one of the things we can think about as I've been involved in this field is here's how I would define Islamic bioethics, right? In a sense. So yeah, in a sense, it's tied to scriptural sources of Islam and the bearers of tradition, right? So it's not just the Quran Sunnah, but it's the authority structures within that. Whether you say Shi'i, Sunni, but it is Islamic didn't end with the Wahi, but it continues forward as you're making tradition. So in some way, the Islamic component would have to think about the scriptural sources and bearers of tradition. And these are the following components of where the ethics comes in, at least. So in one level, it's theology, right? So in a secular audience, it's philosophy, right? So the theological, and for us, that maps onto usuli, right? Both moral theology, but as well as kalami, sort of scholastic, dialectical theology concepts, right? And how they relate on ethics is in this following way. So you have a patient and a physician, and you ask an Islamic ethicist, okay, can we or can we not do something? So if you say, okay, well, what will that action lead to? You're judging the moral status of the end goal, right? So in medicine, near the end of life, we talk about what are the goals of care. So if we think about a notion of what is health in the Islamic tradition, what is illness in the Islamic tradition, those notions aren't necessarily captured just within the legal canonical texts. They're explicated in other areas, right? Ontologically, where is healing coming from? What are the various levels of understanding healing? Is it coming from God? Does it come from how is it brought about in this world? What is the concept of being healthy? What is the normative body? Right? You have a 6th digit on a baby. Can we cut that? Well, what is the normal body? These concepts don't just come in law. They come through other notions of the tradition. So when we're saying that I have a patient and a physician and they're going to do something, does this comport with the end goal of that action? Does it comport with a notion of restoring health in Islam? Right? And flourishing, right? Does it comport with our notions of death and living? Those notions talk about judging actions by the end goal it produces. Okay. Now, the newer modern theories of maqasid get at this as well, right? So maqasid, again, starting with the legal sense, but inducting up what the overarching law should do. It should protect human interests. That's what the law does. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promulgates law to protect human interests. What are those interests? What do they look like? So when we say hifz al-hayat, or hifz al-deen, or we say protection, Islamic maqasid of protection of life, or protection of religion, what is that life? What is that religion? What do we mean by that? So that's the end goal. You have a patient and physician, and you think about, okay, what is the moral status of this action? Is this action, say the patient needs to do abortion, is it morally licit? Is it prohibited? Is it vague in between? What is it? So you're looking at the action. You're not looking at the actors. You're looking at the action, nor are you looking at the end goal necessarily. And that is where fiqh resides. We're judging the moral status of the action by thinking about what the canonical texts tell us about what's going to happen in the afterlife. Right? What do we know? And we go through various means to do that. Then the third component, I would say, is, at least this third component, is how does that happen? Meaning what happens as a result of the action? So now you're thinking about the agent of that action, either the patient or the physician. Are they inculcating and embodying virtues or what we consider virtues in Islam, right, or not? And how do we define those? So there is a way to shake someone's hand, and I can cause injury. There's a way to shake someone's hand, and I don't cause injury. There's some ways I shouldn't shake someone's hand, right? So yes, the law would tell us, well, you don't shake hands here, but does the law tell us, well, apply this much pressure? Or use two hands? Well, there are some, Bukhari, there's a section about, right? I know, but in any case, does it tell us? In what sense? Is it legally illicit to shake with one hand? There's a notion, there's a convention, there's a sense of ethics and embodiment of virtues, right? Or being prudent in your shaking someone's hand. Judicious use of force, whatever you want to say. My point only is there's something more than just the moral status. There's an agent. Is that agent, then you say, go further, is that agent thinking about producing good or not? Is that individual inculcating, embodying a virtuous life? That's their goal, right? And we don't judge intention, but there has, and you think about our manuals for professions in our classical age of Islam, they talked about the adab of the sultan, right? How should a hakim, how should a state actor act, or how should a judge act, or how should a physician act? It was not, here's the Quranic fiqh rulings, but this is the mannerism, the comportment, the etiquettes of how we should act, drawn upon some scriptural sources, but not necessarily. Meaning that you can be the best physician, and doesn't mean that the only source of being a best physician is you have to find some person from the, who is Muslim and who has from the Middle Ages, and that is the best physician. You can go into the wards and find someone who acts the most sort of, honest way with his patients. Maybe that is the best physician, and you should emulate that in your own way, right? So adab doesn't just mean, okay, I need some Quran Sunnah source, but it has to do with conventions of being, of adopting virtues. And if you believe that this message is one that is universal, then it goes both ways. That there are things from looking at urf, and this comes into the Islamic law, but there are other ways of thinking about ethics that just don't have to go to the Quran and Sunnah. So if you think about the Catholic sense of the three fonts of wisdom, right, three fonts of ethics, right, so you have end goal, agent, and action. And the Islamic bioethics must deal with all three of these things. All right? It doesn't so far, if you look at the literature, but this is what I'm sharing with you. Okay, so then the other dimensionality of Islamic bioethics is that it goes from what can I do to what should I do, right? So this notion of legal minimum of what the law says to the perfective optimum of ihsan, how we live our life thinking that God is seeing us. It is not necessarily concordant all the time, meaning that you can do some things and they're perfectly licit. You can divorce one day, marry the next, right? Legally permissible. But the way you do that, or if you're going to do that, and how you treat the individuals who you're divorcing and marrying is very different. Okay? So you go to the perfective optimum of living as if God is seeing you, and then we think it connect the production of being good to producing good. Alright. So Islamic bioethics, and my sort of continuing foray in this area, involves all of these sorts of notions. They draw upon law, fiqh, kalam, adab. That's the Islamic moral machinery. But then you have to be in dialogue with these other areas which have to do with bioethics. Right? It's not just medical practice, it has social science. How does someone feel when the way that you talk to them? How do you engage in surrogate decision making? How do you make decisions together? Right? What are notions of, what is the medicine science behind it? Right? So we know that when we treat in medicine, we're not curing people, right? We think that if someone takes a high blood pressure medication for 10 years, right, every day, we might prevent one heart attack amongst 100 people, right? That's medicine today. There's not a surgery, I'm done, I took out the appendix, you're fine. So you have to engage with medical sciences, contemporary discourse on philosophy and bioethics, and then health policy. So oftentimes I think that we fall short. There's a different notion of analysis for ethics when you think about policy level decisions than you think about just the individual level. Okay. Muslim bioethics, on the other hand, in my construction, would be that it's a sociological study of Muslims responding to ethical challenges with Islam as one input. Right? There are 10,000 things that a person can do who says they're Muslim. Not everything they do is drawn upon this notion of Islam being the guiding principle of that. So you can only get to some things through social scientific studies. And then applied Islamic bioethics sort of bridges both of these, right? You study authorities, you examine the ways in which the material Islamic bioethics is understood by people, so how juridical rulings might be applied by people at the bedside, but also the other way, right? How biomedical concepts like risk, disease, cure, health, illness, right, are translated into the understanding of Islamic jurists. Okay, so that was my intervention on Islamic ethics. Any questions, very briefly, since I took more time than I anticipated? Any questions on that? Alright, so now let's change gears for a moment. Talk about less conceptually ambiguous stuff. Just go to patience. So I'm going to share with you some patience. So we should talk about some empirical notions of what Muslims want. So this is now the easy part for the lecture for a little while before I ramp up near the end. So we all know that Muslims are diverse in many, right? That here in the United States there are about 5 to 7 million Muslims. About a third of them would be Arab American in origin, a third South Asian, and a third African American, right? And then a third, and the other quarter are people of various ethnicities. That they have diverse immigration histories, so 65%, 2/3 are immigrants to this nation, and a third are indigenously born. And you have different histories, right? So the people who came earlier on, the Arabs who came earlier on, there are different socioeconomic strata than the refugees that come today, right? From various parts of the world. So we know that. We also know, but despite the diversity, we also know that 87% of Muslim Americans are English literate. So this is not an exotic community that doesn't speak the language. It's one that is very versed within the language, and they're skilled workers. In terms of income here, you see that how it matches up to the United States general population. About the same number of people in the Muslim community are underneath the 100K level. over the 100K level. So we have well-to-do Muslim individuals in this country. But on the opposite spectrum, nearly half the community is less than 30,000. And that has changed because of the increased refugees that have been coming to the United States over the last decade or so, right? But it used to be closer to the mean, about 36%. This community is more religious than the general university U.S. population. So 65% Sunni, 11% Shia, 69% say that religion is the most important part of their life, while 58% of Americans, general Americans, do. 65% report praying daily. But this is an amazing number here, that 50% men and women attend mosque, right, at least once per week. That makes that this is the center of Muslim life in the United States, right? And this doesn't hold true even in Muslim countries, that the mosque is a critically important social, religious organization for the Muslim community, educational in many ways. So it's a critical structure for the community. So when we have, and this helps you understand, when you have these sorts of debates about whether we can build a mosque in a certain community, why it riles up people's attitudes, because that is the center of their life. Okay. So these are some of the papers I've written on this notion of how Islam influences Muslim health behaviors. I would say that there's three ways, if you think about it, that Islam informs the way that patients think about their health and illness. One, if you take the Islamic beliefs notion, that theological constructions of health and disease are embedded within Islam, right? So when you interview patients and you see studies like this, how do you think about pregnancy, and the way they respond to that has to do with how they think about it in an Islamic way, right? So if pregnancy is a blessing, then that influences the way that you think about contraception or reproductive health. Or if cancer is based on God's decree, because qadar and qada, right, determinism and fatalism are present within Islamic theological doctrines, then that might influence the ways people think about prevention of cancer or other diseases. And we know this from literature. Another way is not theology, but law and ethics, right? So here, notions of impermissibility and permissibility of certain things influences health behaviors and then patterning of health disparities. So yes, Islam prohibits alcohol consumption. Yes, many Muslims adhere to that. Then that might lead to different health risks for, say, liver cirrhosis, right? Or that Muslims are, and I'll get into this further in the subsequent slides, this notion of modesty plays a role in notions of gender concordance and how you interact. That might influence healthcare seeking patterns of patients, both men and women. Lastly, and more increasingly important for us in our current context, is this notion of a Muslim identity. That being a Muslim opens you up to certain types of social experiences, discrimination being one of them, both within the hospital and outside of it. And that might influence your health risks, right? So people who are stressed, we know, Muslims and non-Muslims, tend to do things that they shouldn't do for their health. Smoking, drinking, right? Illicit activities, engage in risky behaviors while driving. These sorts of things happen. So it's not this is just a response to discrimination, stress, marginalization. And then that might influence, if you feel in the healthcare system that people are not sensitive to your Muslim identity, then you might not want to go back. Right? You might not want to go seek care at that facility or stay away from the hospital. Okay. So in Michigan, we did a study with 13 focus groups with 102 people, men and women at mosques, both Arab, South Asian, and African American mosques. And we asked them simply, right, this question: if the hospital said, donor came, said, we'll give you $100,000 or $500,000. Tell me what you want changed in the hospital to make you feel more comfortable. What would you want them to do? And the top three things across race, ethnicity, and gender were these top three things. Gender concordant care was number one, as much as possible in most focus groups. Then they talked about halal food, and then a distinguished, separate prayer place. So let's kind of deconstruct them a little bit. And here's some data on this same-sex phenomenon. I just bring this up because I've done multiple studies on this phenomenon, and some of it is counterintuitive evidence here. So I studied 97 adult Muslims coming to mosque, and 21% had delayed skincare. You just ask them, if you didn't find or haven't found a provider of the same sex, have you delayed care because of that? 1 out of 5. This is men and women. When you do work here in Chicago, 24 Muslim women from masajid, but also from civic organizations like Muslim Women's Resource Center, other places where it's not a masjid, right? It's just people who are drawn to a Muslim identity. So over 50% had reported delaying skincare, right? And those who have higher religiosity or greater notions of modesty were ones more likely to delay care. So this is a phenomenon that occurs very commonly within the Muslim community. And it has implications for how we deliver health care. Important, I think this is also important. When you interview individuals and you talk about their healthcare experiences, you'll notice that this is a clear clear thing that troubles them sometimes. So for example, a woman, this is the first quote, is from a woman who went to the ED for some vaginal complaint, and she was examined by a male, and then she says, right, years after that, I wish the ground had swallowed me up. But this is what she retained. She didn't remember that she got treated with antibiotics for something, or that maybe that infection would have caused her some damage to her reproductive health, but she remembered this. I wish the ground had fallen me up. That carried with her many years after. Or there was a Muslim who would go to a clinic, and she went to a clinic where every few months there would be a new doctor, probably a resident clinic, right? So she didn't have a consistent provider, and every time, you know, there'd be some issue at that clinic about she's wearing a hijab, how can you take care of her? And she said it's not as if the patient has to say, pay attention, I'm a Muslim woman, I have this modesty issue. That every time the onus was on her. No one would say, okay, well, look, I understand, let me try to manage things around, but the onus was always on her to raise this issue, and they would try to struggle to accommodate. The last quote is from a Turkish individual who spent several months after a stroke in a rehab facility. And for him, you know, the stroke aside, he felt that he was really upset about the daily dignity that he suffered every day. And for him it was this, that the worst thing for me was being watched by a woman every morning. He couldn't take care of himself, didn't have family around. And so, you know, a nurse would come and bathe him every morning. And that was just, after a full life of being fully capable, to be in that state was humiliating for him every day. So this is something that people carry forth. In terms of halal food, here are some quotes for you. Again, you know, yes, in one sense, this was a notion that halal, for the people that I interviewed, that halal had to do something with being healthier. And God has legislated halal food in a certain way, because it's healthier for us, perhaps. And therefore, when we don't have it during our illnesses, it's actually preventing us from healing well. But at the same time, the notion of social justice, particularly in Michigan, was clear. So a participant said in our focus group, said, look, you know, everybody else, all I get is vegetarian. Every time I ask for halal food, we have vegetarian, but everybody else gets something, right? You have all these other types of meals, but for me, no one can accommodate. And in terms of prayer area, again, the notion, and I'm highlighting this, there was a notion tied to healing here, right? That prayer is a form of healing. I'm in the hospital, asking for dua, you know, doing Jummah Salah, whatever it might be, and I don't find a space where there's free of iconography, right? Or there's no chaplain, or there's to lead prayers, no one comes visit me and, you know, does Quran for me. That this notion of lack of prayer and having a distinct prayer space was pretty important. And obviously in the climate they were today, there were some social repercussions of not having a prayer area, right? People, this quote's from an individual, a family that sort of said that, you know, we visited our family, our relative, tried to pray, it's not a private room, the person next door got scared, didn't know what was going on, called security, and it was this sort of whole fiasco. All we were trying to do is praying how we pray. So in the interest of time, you know, I don't want to go through all these notions, but I want to really highlight this notion of modesty, because it often comes up in audiences about how this plays a role in healthcare, right? Because it's critical, as I showed you, some critically important to many individuals that I've interviewed in the studies shows up. So the notion is drawn from, obviously you all know this, but from the Quran and the Sunnah, right? That we have verses in the Quran that tell us that, you know, believing men and women, you know, to lower your gaze, to guard your private parts. We have the Prophet Muhammad saying that, that Islam's innate character is a character of modesty. And what happens is that these pieces, these scriptural sources, have set up this hierarchy for seeking healthcare physicians, right, that jurists have commented on. So they sort of say, there's my timer. So they sort of say that if all else is equal, like just imagine all else is equal, then a Muslim patient should seek a physician of the same gender, right, a male physician, whether they be Muslim or not. So it's obviously better to have a Muslim physician of your gender than not. The reason being because they can advise you when you can forego worship rituals like fasting and other things. But this is what they've come up with, that gender is prioritized over religion. And this affects notions of how you interact and cover yourself, gowning, for example, or how you participate in physical examinations being, you know, secluded with a provider. So these textual notions play a role in juridical guidelines around all these: physical contact, choice of physician, and then as well as seclusion with people. So and we can get back to this in the Q&A if you want to, but this is a pretty important notion. And the reason I bring it up is it's tied to religion. Oftentimes, and as a physician, some people say to me, you know, or think that this is just a cultural notion, right, or some sort of, you know, patrilineal society, but actually is embedded within core texts within our faith. Okay, now I'm coming to a close. So the second part of the title I was given by Dr. Ali had to do with Islamic healthcare delivery, right? And I want to comment with you and help you give you some sense of how I think about this, but then hopefully we can have an engaged conversation about this issue or other things that come up. So when you think about it, right, particularly in our context in the United States, there are a lot of healthcare-related institutions and organizations that draw upon some inspiration in Islam, right? And they do this very explicitly, or they say they do. That you have, for example, Ummah Clinic, right? You're partnered with several projects. They talk about healthcare for all inspired by Islam. You have the American Muslim Health Professionals, right? Where their tagline is where faith and healthy communities come together. You have Iman in Chicago, right? It has a health clinic, but just the organization is obviously more of a social determinants of health organization. They say that they want to be the model of the Muslim tradition of facilitating transformational change in urban communities. So again, drawing upon Islam. And then Imana, the Islamic Medical Association of North America, their tagline is to become the recognized leader in national and global healthcare guided by Islamic values. So these are just some, and you can find others, but they draw, or at least in their statements, they draw upon a notion of Islam that's guiding their healthcare delivery, the way they think about things, their inspiration for the organization itself. And I think that in some way, I think for Muslims, we should think about how Catholic social teachings influence the way they think about their healthcare. And that would be a good model to think about, do we have analogous systems, right? And let's not talk about Catholic healthcare systems, but you will find that particularly in the United States, there are a lot of, the Catholic aside, other Christian organizations that are truly inspired by the vision of the Eucharist, or the vision by, X, Y, Z, and they carry that throughout their healthcare system. And for us, when we think about Islamic colleges, or Islamic institutions, or Islamic bioethics, or Islamic whatever, we have taglines often, but how does that play a role in the day-to-day way that people deal with people? I'm not exactly sure, but I think we need much more research on that. So let me give you a sense of how we can think about this, at least at a preliminary level. So we know that medicine and healthcare attend to human frailty, right? That when a patient comes in and they are disturbed in their body, you recognize that their body's failing, that they're recognizing the finitude of life, right? I could speak one day, I can't tomorrow, right? I was able to walk unassisted, now I can't. A little bug has caused me to have diarrhea for 5 days, right? And I can't eat, and I vomit. That there's human frailty, the reminder of the finitude of life, that if you're a Muslim patient, that perhaps you're thinking about something else coming after this life. That we know that medicine responds to these people at this moment of helplessness, right? It's a godly response. If you think about when you were troubled, if you're a religious individual, when you're most significantly in duress, and you call upon God to help you, because you don't know what else to do, that is similar to the way when a patient, when the things that they believe they have control over are failing them, right? They're failing them. And that when a patient and physician encounter, we have to recognize that we are ministering or tending to them in this moment of need. And the way we do so should be the way that we expect God to take care of us. Right? And then thirdly, that healthcare itself, right, assists with people living to the maximum potential that they have. It helps your notions of flourishing. Right? We have many texts, and this is why there are debates around the notion of, well, it's settled, but in the sense that medicine is a part of the kafaya. Having knowledge of medicine within the community is a part of the kafaya, because of the notion that people who are healthy can better worship and do good works. It's an integral part of our deen. I think there's a debate of whether hifz al-hayat, hifz of life, protection of life, or hifz al-deen is the most overarching principle or higher objective Islamic law. These debates are couched in this notion. Is health instrumental to deen, or is it not? But my point only here is that medicine does, or healthcare does, help service these dimensions of individuals. Right? People who are healthier, right? And there's a hadith about this, right? That people who are healthier can do more. So we should notice that this is an instrumental usage of healthcare. So, and that our scriptures have some substrate for philosophy of care, right? We know that the verse says, and the Prophet Abraham is quoted to say that, that when I am sick, it is He who cures me. So we understand that what we're doing are as instruments of of bringing about healing from God. So, what does that mean at the end? Well, I talked about American institutions. There are some other institutions, I think, that are interesting in the way they think about it. So this is an institution in Malaysia. There is a hospital that marks itself as an ibadah-friendly hospital. That they say, and the philosophy is this, and I met this individual behind this movement, he sort of said, look, we as human beings, as Muslims, right, our reason for living is to worship God, to do good works, to perform our prayers, right? But oftentimes in the healthcare system, that gets neglected. I want to create an institution that is a worship-friendly place. That you be recognized that that's the essential aspect of being a human being, is recognizing God, praying and worshiping God. We're going to facilitate that in this hospital. How does that happen? Well, it happens by nurses, there's prayer time is noted, is there to pray. If you need to, when you're in a hospital, if you stay in a hospital, for various reasons, you know that you get interrupted to wake at different times, your sleeping patterns are altered. Well, the nurse will help you, remind you if you want to get for prayer. If you can't pray, if you can't do ablution, they'll help you with that. They'll give you tayammum stuff. There'll be a tayammum if you can't use water. We have some facilities for that. We have Islamic scholars who will help you make those critical decisions should you want their guidance. We even have little halaqat in the hospital every day or every week for our staff to help think about how you can be a better, more righteous individual. Right? So this is the notion for them of how Islam transforms the way they deliver healthcare. I'm not saying this is the only notion, but they're taking it to that level of philosophy of entire embodiment of this notion of Islam within the institution. I'll skip the other one. But the other ones have to do with actually bringing in traditional healing patterns from Islam. Right? Perhaps you should provide hajama or whatever else it might be as well. So, I'm closing now. But when you think again in our dynamic here in the United States, 81% of my national survey of Muslim physicians, 81% of the physicians said, I feel called by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to practice medicine, right? 4 out of 5. But when you talk to them about how they think about that, you'll see the numbers drop off. Do they provide Muslim service? Right? They provide medical relief work in Muslim countries. 3/4, never. Right? Do they serve in Muslim clinics? More than half, never. A third, maybe sometimes a year. Do they talk to imams about bioethics cases? Because there are a lot of issues in our community. 3/4, never. Right? Do they provide consultations in mosques for people who are indigent? A third, never. 44% say a few times a year at maximum. If they think about Islamic Bioethics, do you read Islamic Bioethics books? More than half, never or rarely. Right? Do you talk to Islamic jurists? 64% never or rarely. When you consult Islamic medical fiqh academies, right, where top caliber jurists and physicians come together, almost 80% never or rarely. So for me, it's this sort of disconnect between a notion of we are inspired by Islam, but what does that mean for the day-to-day living of that within the healthcare system? And I think that if we better understand where ethics comes in, then we can bring a holism to this. So I think that's something I'm done. I will end, inshallah, to take your questions and answers. Thank you. That's not my phone. I don't know who that is. All right, please. Yes, go ahead. No, behind you, Professor.
Just 2 days ago, a Muslim physician, female physician who wears hijab, was arrested in Michigan for performing female genital mutilation in the United States.
Yeah.
And she studied at Johns Hopkins. She was not that physician. I want to use this example to put it into this framework of bioethics, that where we have a practice which is culturally strong, present in North African communities, which is morally repulsive, and Sharia is kind of mute on it, that Muslim society really will try to eliminate. So obviously they will accept it. So how do we handle that? You see, from patient's perspective, what constitutes moral and ethical? From physician's perspective, and the perspective of society.
Very good. Yes.
So I want to bring this complexity in our things.
Yeah.
How you explain it.
It's a very good example. As you said, it kind of gets into all these notions. I didn't think about it in that way, but it does. So my response, I think there are a few sort of responses to that. I think that, let's take the analysis paradigm that you set up. So just describing what we alleged is to have happened or not happened, right? So from a patient perspective, you have a family who is making decisions about their children to undergo some sort of procedure at some clinic, and they're eliciting the support of some physician to do that, right? So the Islamic sort of notion that well, how do we think about the responsibility of parents to their children vis-a-vis their body parts, right? So it's not think about FGM or whatever, but think about piercings, the sixth toe I talked about, right? About circumcision. So what are the bounds and responsibilities of a parent to their children, and what authority do they have to change the normative body? And this is why I sort of said the notion of the normative body is critical important to medicine, right? But not often explicated within our tradition easily and accessibly. But that's one notion. So I think it comes into the authority of the patient, of the parents, to make decisions about what would be the normative body for a patient, and is that the normative body, a woman without whatever was going on there. That's one. From the physician perspective, so now let's think about a physician is an emergency medicine physician. Within my conventions of board certified emergency medicine, that is not a position that I am. That is not a procedure, or that I am considered to be proficient, sufficient, boarded, having anything to do with, right? So is this actually within the domain of medicine, or is it not? Right? Is it outside the bounds of scopes of practice? People can sort of give Botox. ED physicians can give Botox injections, but there's some sort of licensure structure for that, right? Other procedures where I can't go and do cardiac surgery, nor can I go actually pierce your ear. I'm not licensed to do that. So these sorts of things we have to think about. And the third sort of thing, I think, from the societal perspective here, clearly you have a practice that has been legislated by American law to be, in all of its forms, prohibited and illicit. And so if you say that there is some, as you were getting at this conflict, if you have conflict between what are the scopes of practice or standards of practice or what is within my boundaries, but then you have a legal structure that's defined that this something is outside of it, then you are liable, right? This is why they're sort of saying that you can't do something that we have as a society legislated that isn't permissible. Now, none of that actually has to do with anything in the sense of, except for adding an overlay of Islamic responsibilities to the parents of other children. It has nothing to do with anything that's Islamic in a sense, right? All those analogous patterns of, this is something within the bounds of legal practice for any society or any community listening or not. Is there something that you can go do something that's not the standard of care or practice for medicine, has to do with medicine? Now, can you deal with a patient in a certain, a child in a certain way, giving authorization from the parents? So that's something. Now, the Islamic component, I think the other thing that we need to recognize, and I think this is embedded in your comment, that jurists, the relationship between FGM and Islam is one that's often, what's the word? Is often misunderstood. I think is the best word, right? So what that, in my reading of that sort of case, and there are actually in the American Academy of Pediatrics talked about this many years ago, about there are 4 types of FGM, right? Or FGC is the proper, right? Female genital cutting. And the first type of ritual nick was actually the American Academy of Pediatrics several years ago came up with saying, well, this is one that potentially is an area where you think about cultural accommodations. All other 3 are not, right? Because you're actually removing the hood, the clitoris, you're doing various things. Now, I'm not privy, and so similarly, actually, Islamic scholars, when they talked about, in medieval texts, even in some of our Shafi manuals, they talk about, what is permissible, licit, the status of the action to do to genitalia. Most of them had sort of talked about the first level of something that's sort of like a ritual thinking, again, coming in from a cultural paradigm, saying that maybe if there's no harm, if there's harm, then don't do it, but if there's no harm, we can continue this practice can continue in communities that is there, right? So it wasn't a condonement or saying you must do this, but it was like something exists in our society here. Can you do this? And they said if there is no harm, this is the permissibility that's offered potentially. But it was a contingent permissibility. Now societal conventions and oath have moved beyond that potentially, and we should think about that. But that's how it came into being. And my colleagues of mine at Azhar or whatever have written on this extensively. that these other things are not permissible. I don't know why we're talking about it and whatever else it might be, but it gets sort of politicized in a certain sort of way. Even the way you sort of said that a Muslim physician, right, came in. Well, I don't know that person's relationship to Islam or not. I understand she's from the Dawoodi Bohra community, which is an Ismaili offshoot. How does that have to do with these juridical rulings? I'm not quite sure. So I think that it's much more complicated. But my bringing it together in the sense that, look, you have to think about the act, right? The agent, in this case, were the parents making decisions for the child. What is permissible there? What is not? What is ethical and what is not? And then the end goal, which we didn't talk about. What is the end goal of this? Right? So people sort of say this has to do with some notion of feminine sexuality. Well, do we have any data to corroborate that or not? And why would we do this, right? So, and if there is data on the harm of the end goal of this, and again, our primary responsibility is la darura dirara. So that's the way I'd start to weigh in on this. But obviously, I'm not a jurist, so those are my thoughts at this point. Other questions?
Is
Yes, sir.
contraception halal?
Under the table, I guess it's I don't. You have to specify what that means. So jurists have written about different. There's a spectrum of what contraception is. They've also written about different reasons to do so, right? So like Imam Ghazali lays out rulings for when women can engage in contraception with the permission of the husband or vice versa. So today, obviously that was in the 12th century. Today we have many different views of contraception. Some even say abortion is part of contraception. So you'd have to really define what you mean by contraception. Then I can kind of tell you at least what the jurists and my reading of the jurist literature can tell you about that. But what do you mean by that?
If somebody doesn't want
Yeah, so there's conditions to everything shurut, right?
children,
Right, so in the sense that contraception, so I'll set out the boundaries for you. That again, my reading of the juridical literature, because you're asking about the moral status of the action, that permanent sterilization is normatively prohibited. Abortion is normatively prohibited by the jurists listening schools. There are exceptions when this might be permissible, but the normative status is prohibition. As far as contraception resides in the larger category of, makruh to mubah, right? Reprehensible to mubah, but there are conditions under which it becomes either of those, right? So it's permissible in certain notions, again, without harm and what are you using it for, and then it becomes reprehensible in certain circumstances, right? So people fearing for children, God not providing this sort of thing. Well, maybe that relates it to a makruh status that it should be reprehensible to use, but they don't necessarily say it's impermissible, perhaps. So that's the sort of the spectrum. But again, every moral status of an action has to be understood in the context of what that action is taking place. But that's the general sort of outline. Yes, I'll come back to you. Go ahead.
So what are your thoughts on organ donation from your perspective?
So the way yeah, in 2 minutes. So let me say one thing. I think that these sorts of questions really, did a 3-day workshop on dissecting the ethics of organ donation. I think these sorts of questions about contraception, organ donation, and the life care are ones that require the multidisciplinary perspective that I drew out for you, right? That requires not just taking the jurist's rulings, but thinking about the context and bringing people together, having a conversation. Because they're not resolved questions, right? The best what we can do, as I just did, give you some juridical boundary points and that's it, but it doesn't get you much more than that. So in that light, I'll tell you there are 3 larger categories of how jurists have thought about organ donation, but you should recognize that all organs are not the same, which is a failing sometimes for us to distinguish. Like getting a cornea is different than getting a liver, is different than getting a heart, right? What is vital, what's not vital. So the status of that action needs to depend on what organ we're talking about. Not all organs are life-saving, right? Some are life sort of enhancing. The other notion is that not all organs are procured at the same time. So there's a debate around brain death and organ procuration after death versus living. So it's very, very, very complicated. And each of them would have different juridical rulings, and some jurists don't actually opine on them, so it leaves you sort of, as I said, well, which organization they're talking about, right? Because there can't be a blanket ruling like that. But there are 3 camps, generally. One sort of says that organ donation is prohibited save for life. live donation, so there are only certain organs that you take when you're living, right? I can give a kidney if I have another kidney, but I obviously can't give my heart because I'll be dead. Right? So some, and then that has to be done with consent and no harm to the donor. Another camp sort of says that, so their general ruling is haram except for living, okay? The other camp says permissible, right? Because of maslaha, meaning that it is a permissible thing. So no, they're not saying it's recommended or obligatory generally, but it is permissible because of the need, the communal benefit of organs, because people have organs, people are dying because they don't have organs, right? There's a 10 to 1 rate of 10 people on the donor list, one of them gets the organ, the other 9, right, are going to get one, and they might die because of that. So they use this notion. It's complicated because maslaha has to do with this notion, or maslaha amma has to do with the notion of everybody being able to get these organs, and now in various countries and various systems you can't. So if you didn't have insurance, could you get a transplant in the United States? Could you get on the waiting list? Could someone operate on you? So if it's not a communal, societal level benefit, then you have to think about whether that ruling applies. The third category is that it is permissible only because of the darura. It's only permissible because of dire need. And the dire need means what? That the patient will die or has a significant harm, right? So then you think, again, certain organs cause that, some organs don't. But then you have to think about, are there other treatments? Because you can only invoke darura if there is no other treatment. So for an example, if I'm 85 and my expectancy is 3 years in life and I have kidney failure, I can stay on dialysis and my life expectancy is more than 3 years. Why do I need to get an organ donation, right? So then again, it becomes contingent on this notion that there's a dire need, a life threat or a organ, or maybe something significant, but then that there are no other therapies available for that. Or you couldn't live without it, right? So like, if I can't see very well through my eye, may God protect us from that, but can I do that or not? So this is the general camps, but as I said, as I just showed you, it becomes very complicated very quickly. So I can't do much more justice than this. Okay, is this the final question?
So
No, we have time. You go ahead.
So quickly, you mentioned Muslim bioethics, and you said it was like a sociological study of how we respond to ethical challenges. So how does that fit into that framework that you gave? The end goal, and then the morals, and then the agents of the being. So how do they relate? And does it inform those three, or how do they relate those two?
So what I was trying to do was, when you would go to Google or to PubMed or to any library software and you pick up a study that says, we studied, organ donation practices in the upper delta of Egypt, then you understand that study's focus is on understanding how people are thinking about that, right? And that is not necessarily on trying to propound up or derive up some ethical principles for us to adopt. So your question actually is how we would relate social scientific findings to how we think about Islamic ethics. Yeah. So I think that is a question that many people struggle with, jurists and not, right? Because these concepts of harm, benefit, are ones that have to do with the gaze upon society, right? Right? It's not. So some scholars, would say the mafsada, right? Anything that harms or disturbs. I mean, if you take that notion, then potentially someone in the wrong way, you want to say, okay, well look, then we can't even put a IV in a patient. It harms them. You understand? But then you say, well, what's the goal of that IV? How are we thinking about that? So my point only is that they're connected in the sense that we have to use the social scientific findings about how people interpret, experience, and think about things to inform the way we in the juridical system think about those rulings that are contingent upon those understandings, right? Where we're using urf or maslaha or darura or all these things, and you say, okay, well, can you tell me what the data is on that? And this enhancement upon the way that we think about things, I think, is critical for our tradition to engage with modern systems of knowledge. We do that in other fields. In this field, so far, it's not quite as good. But I'm not saying bound up. So I am a bioethicist who takes the notion that you can't necessarily get to what ought to be from what is, but you can inform your notions of what ought to be from what is. All right. I'm going to stop there. Is that permissible, Sheikh?
Oh, sure, of course, but just a little bit about LGBT. 3 days workshop.
I don't have anything canned to prepare for that response.
Okay.
So I will defer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Safa.
Thank you for coming and spending your time with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.